Hi, I'm your friend Claude.
And I am just Jamie.
And today's episode is all about our trip to experience the 6th annual Retro GameCon event. What did we get? What did we see? Stay tuned and find out on the N.E.R.D.Bomber podcast.
We went to our third con together of the year of 2018. And it was probably, although the genre was different, it was probably the best one in terms of how it was pulled off. And that was Retro GameCon 6 up in Syracuse.
Indeed it was. 3 in 1 year is easily 3 times more than we've done in the previous decade.
This is true.
Yeah.
No, there was a lot of cool stuff. I mean, like I said, I think this was probably the best pulled off con that we went to this year. The other two, while fun in their own ways, were sort of amateurish, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't want to rag on them too much because it's not that I had a bad time at those.
No.
But this was definitely sort of a pretty big deal. And I think even they said in their social media, I guess it's probably a Facebook page, they said that next year they'll probably try to find a bigger venue.
I gotta say, I think that might be a little weird because it's a pretty big venue. It's a suitable venue. I kind of take issue with the way they make use of the venue. I think they probably could use it a little better. I was confused I know that they technically say it's a retro game con. They don't specifically say just video games. So, there's a big portion of that area towards the back that's dedicated to kind of free use of board games, a lot of tables and different,
right, like tabletop gaming, and things like that.
I feel like that maybe could be put somewhere else. There's a lot of the same type of thing going on with video games downstairs, so maybe a portion of that could be given to board games. I feel like you could get more vendors and stuff that way. I don't know that I felt like they packed the space, but it was easily larger than both of the previous conventions we went to put together.
Oh, for sure. For sure it was. And the last one we went to was in a similarly sized space.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
It was just so sparse that it seems it was a little bit disappointing. But yeah, I guess you're right. They talk about wanting to use a different venue, but it didn't feel overwhelming being there. This was at the On Center in Syracuse, New York, the convention center. If you really are interested, you could look it up. It's a pretty nice, decently sized space. They had the big major main convention floor filled with vendors and games and arcade setups, and there was even a stage with people on stage doing various things, whether it be talking or there was a band playing basically live rock scores to video games. There was a separate convention hall dedicated to, I guess, tournament gaming.
It was tournament, and there was I was actually, in full disclosure, I went for not only the day that we went together, but also the next day I went back. And I explored that downstairs gaming area a little bit more, and it's actually pretty cool. There's a lot of, I don't even know, maybe 50 TVs set up with different, various systems from throughout the years. Some of them are multiples, but there's a lot of different examples of systems that you can just go in and sit down and play if nobody's using it. Yeah,
it looked like there were also some old PCs in there.
Yeah, lots of them.
But there was upstairs. There was a separate exhibition hall.
Yeah.
And was that the tournament gaming? Because we didn't venture in there the day that we went.
Yeah, I only there were a bunch of kind of private rooms set aside for this, as well as the main convention floor. There were rooms for panel discussions, and I think some of those might have been double. Multi-purpose.
Right.
Also been used for some of the tournament play.
Repurposed,
yes. The gaming room I was in, at least when I was in there, was just kind of almost like a free-for-all.
Right, okay.
Towards the end, when I was leaving, they did have a really cool duck hunt contest.
Oh,
people lined up, and basically it was kill as many ducks in a row as you can, and when you don't, you're out.
Right.
And whoever gets the most wins.
Yeah.
I don't know what the prize was, but I just liked that idea a lot, and I definitely would have joined if we had more time.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we missed a couple of the things that I would have liked to seen on the first day, which was Saturday. I couldn't go Sunday, so we had to kind of squeeze it into a Saturday trip. We missed out on Charles Martinet, the longtime voice of Mario.
Still got to hear him do it from afar.
And then the other thing that I was interested in was they were doing it wasn't really a panel. I guess it was more a competition, sort of. These two sort of video game personalities. One was John Riggs, who's pretty well known on YouTube. He's part of sort of the Metal Jesus crew of retro gaming people.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, he's part of that group of people.
Nice.
And I forget the name of the other guy. I apologize for that. Basically, they were doing all in real time, like a competition to make a fully functional NES game on NES Maker. And you basically could just sit and watch them sort of develop everything from start to finish, sort of in competition with one another. And that sounds like an interesting thing that I would have liked to enjoy, but we missed it. So I'm not going to lament it too heavily. Just I think it would have been kind of interesting to watch.
This was on Saturday before we got there?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so that must have been, because on Sunday I saw what had to have been the results of that.
Maybe,
there were some tables set up, and they were basically like, they had to be about 8-bit games, and they were games I didn't recognize, and they were kind of like a whole huge display dedicated to them, so I imagine.
I saw a sign up that they had like an NES Maker workshop or something going on, so that might have been an opportunity for people to get their hands on it.
Right.
I don't know if that was within the same presentation as this competition between these two guys.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, but either way, I missed it. It's all right.
Well, speaking of getting your hands on things, the video game room I mentioned earlier kind of blew me away because it kind of gave me my first chance to actually experience playing a lot of things I've only kind of seen pictures of and heard about before.
Right.
Things like the Atari Jaguar, things like something I've never even knew existed was called something like Famicom Box or something, but it still had the Nintendo logo like on it as well, and it was basically almost like a jukebox for Japanese NES games.
Wow, all right.
Like there must have been, I want to say probably 12 games in it.
Okay.
And
this
they were
like an arcade setup?
No, it was like almost like a large VCR looking object that hooked up to a regular TV.
Like a multi-disc changer.
Yeah, and you could switch between the games that were in there.
All right.
And it had the control of the regular Nintendo controllers and the light gun like hardwired into it.
Wow.
So that's a really unique thing.
So that's interesting because there was an arcade cabinet called the Nintendo Play Choice 10 or something back in the day.
Yes.
I wonder if the technology is related to that, you know.
Yeah, very well could
be.
be.
The inner workings of that arcade cabinet and tried to make, apparently failed because I've never heard of this.
Right.
Some sort of at-home version of this. I'm wondering about that. I don't know the history of it.
Yeah. Well, I didn't. When I saw it from afar, it almost looks like it's from like the 40s or something. Like, what is this weird 40s radio thing doing here? And then you get up on it and realize what it is. And
yeah.
It was very cool.
Yeah, that was the thing. Well, in addition to the thing I wanted to see, that's what I missed out on, sort of having to do a quicker visit on Saturday, was getting my hands on more gaming, you know, just trying some different things. I did play a little bit of the arcade game Road Blasters, which I finished the first level. No big deal. But yeah, I think so. Next year, I definitely have my eyes on going and definitely spending a full day and being able to take my time.
Yeah.
And enjoy both the vendors and getting my hands on some different stuff.
Right. I didn't really. This is different than my approach to comic book convention. I didn't really go to this event with like a preset agenda for any kind of games I wanted or anything like that. I mean, there's always kind of a rough wish list in my brain for games, but never anything I actively hunt. It's more of like if I come across it, awesome. Yeah. But if I don't, then so be it. And I mentioned to you, I think on the day, that I'd kind of forgotten that it was primarily a video game convention. So I was kind of thinking about my comic book wish list and trying to remember what I needed to look for and realize, oh, well, that's probably not going to be the case at this one. But lo and behold, there was a vendor with several long boxes of comic books, and I came away with several titles on both days for a pretty reasonable fee. However, I did also pick up a copy of the WWF game No Mercy for Nintendo 64 that I was initially very excited about getting. So excited, in fact, that I did not even check the condition of the the actual physical game. So not only, basically, let me explain it this way: there are two versions in America, anyway, of No Mercy. One of them is kind of known to be glitchy, and you can spend a lot of time. In fact, we have before spent a lot of time doing making creative characters and things, and having all this game progress made, and then as soon as you turn it off and turn it back on, it's back to kind of a factory default with all that gone. So there's a certain serial number that's known to not have the glitch. I thought I had found it, and in fact I looked at the wrong number. So it turns out I do not have the copy I wanted that I was so excited about. And I also have most likely a defective copy, as the inside is very rusty and very corroded.
Pins are in pretty bad shape. When I actually saw them when I arrived here today to record, and it happened to be sitting there, and I did you look inside of here? It looks it's a little bit rough.
I essentially made a $9 donation to that vendor.
They gotcha.
My second pickup, which I believe is in much better shape, my brother has that one, is a copy of Shadows of the Empire, also for Nintendo 64. And if nothing else, we'll relive some memories through that game.
Right. Yeah, I definitely didn't get any comics. I did peruse the boxes for a minute, but I was pretty switched on to the video game. My brain was switched on to video games in that moment, so they didn't really suck me in that much.
Right.
There was another vendor there with some old toys and stuff, and that didn't really suck me in either. I was definitely sort of focused on the video game thing. I did get a couple pickups that I'm pretty happy with. There's a little bit of disappointment, but it's not connected to what I bought. I do actually have sort of an ongoing list, because there's a few systems that I collect for in terms of video games. NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, Game Gear, Game Boy Advance, PS1 and 2. Those are the systems that I have, and those are the systems for which I can buy games. So I always keep a list active on my phone. I'm not always staring at it, when I'm in a place that sells games, but I will refer to it from time to time. And I was able to knock some stuff off that list, which I was pretty happy about. And really, I got some pretty good deals. The very first vendor we walked in, it was right in front of I immediately got anxious about it, because I was like, man, I've already spent so much time at this one place. I was worried about seeing everything before we ran out of time that first day.
All right.
But they had like a copy of F1 Race for Game Boy for $1.
Hey, I'm Russell, and I got Wayne here. What's up? And this new F1 Race for Game Boy. Up to 4 guys can play each other at the same time. Whoa, major crash! Use the turbo, man.
Number 3's dusting him.
Each guy's got his own race.
Whoa, right!
In his own screen and his very own view of the race.
No, he's got what's quick.
I don't know what Wayne said was. I don't know what he said. Anyway, F1 Race for Game Boy from Nintendo. 4-player adapter, things included. Game Boy sold separately.
Round up your posse and check it out.
Classic.
And it is a classic game, and for $1, I was like, well, if nothing else, I've got that. So pick that up for $1. The next thing I saw was a copy of Super Mario Brothers 3 for NES for $6.
Mario! Mario! Mario!
He's back. All you had to do was ask. Super Mario Brothers 3 from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Classic.
And that it is very classic also. And it's well under the usual going rate for that game. I mean,
right.
That's not a super expensive game, but again, for Nintendo, when you're talking about like their core characters,
right.
Mario and Kirby and even Mega Man, even though that's not necessarily strictly Nintendo, but certain titles are a little bit more of that medium price range. I'm never going to buy a $50 plus video game for a 30 or 40-year-old system.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about 20 or 30 something, I can flirt with the idea. So anyway, Super Mario 3 in most cases costs around $20, but I found a copy for $6. So couldn't pass that up. And then the bigger things that I got that I was really excited about getting actually was a copy of a little bit of an obscure title for Genesis called Ranger X. essentially a side-scrolling shooter, but it's also kind of a platform. You're not really platforming. It's kind of a shoot 'em up in beat 'em ups. That's hard to explain. I guess it defies genre a little bit. You're playing as a robot and you're shooting a bunch of stuff that's coming at you. And throughout the game, you can link up with sort of this, I almost want to call it a skateboard. It's this little rocket pack on wheels. And your robot can link up with that. I think later on in the game, there's a flight pack. So there's different configurations of the character that you play and different ways to take out all the enemies. There's a lot of enemies on screen. It's very arcadey, and you will lose quickly. So there's a lot of sort of replay and memorize and that sort of thing. It looks amazing, like graphically. It's just another example of how you and I kind of share the sort of not super common opinion that the Genesis just visually looks better than the Super Nintendo in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
I know that the Super Nintendo is performance-wise, it's a higher level machine, and I guess maybe it's more polished, more color palettes, better sound. But I don't know. There's just something about the Genesis that I have always really liked. So
yeah, same here.
Anyway, Ranger X is a great example of that. So I got that home, played it. It looks great. It runs great. F1 Race looks great, runs great on my Game Boy Advance. So it's an original Game Boy game. So it's meant to be played in black and white, but those games were often programmed in with a color palette.
Right.
So they could be played on a Superboy,
yeah,
which could be plugged into the whatever, so you could play it on TV. And those color palettes also work on a Game Boy Advance. So there's some different color palettes you can sort of use. Anyway, it works. The disappointment came in. One game I forgot to mention was Batman for Nintendo.
It's here. Batman, the video game. From Sunsoft. For the Nintendo Entertainment System. Let the battle begin.
It was a movie tie-in game. A very popular game, and from all accounts and from what I've seen a video on it, a very high-level 8-bit game in terms of its graphics. Kind of like pushes the original Nintendo to its graphical limits. And I was really excited to give that a try and to play Mario 3. And it turns out my system at home, the 8-bit cartridge slot for my clone system is no longer functional. The system's made by a company called Retrobit. It's a Retro Duo, so it has it's a clone system, but it's all hardware. It has a NES and an SNES cartridge slot. It only cost me $40, so I'm not so obsessed with games that I have to have the original systems, and that becomes problematic anyway, because those systems are 20 or 30 years old, and you've got to figure out a way to plug them into a modern TV, so it becomes a little bit problematic. So I was really happy with the system for a long time. But the one problem that it always had is that the NES cartridge slot hangs onto the cartridges really, really tightly. And when you have to pull those cartridges out, the system basically breaks itself. It doesn't do any damage to the cartridges, but the pin, the pickups in the system get bent. So, I mean, I might try to open it up and take a look and see if there's anything obvious I can do, but I'm not much of an electronics repair person.
Right.
And I don't know that the system is worth being modded when I can pick up an NES player for $20-ish.
Right.
So, anyway.
Have you ever seen online if that's a common problem with that thing?
No, not really. Of the clone systems, a lot of purists don't like any of them. So, so I kind of take the negative reviews with a grain of salt because people are just sort of really snobby about it.
That's true.
But of the clone systems that play NES games, Retrobit tends to be the highest thought of. The other big one that makes them is Hyperkin.
Yeah.
And they make the Retrons, which are all kinds of different forms for different games over the years that I think I've talked about before on the show.
Right.
So the systems they make for just NES games without multiple cartridge slots, just the one slot for NES games, tend to be fairly cheap. So at some point, I'll probably just pick one of those up. So anyway, I was disappointed that I couldn't play those games, but I was still happy to get them. And for all of the games that I got, I found really great deals.
You mentioned having kind of an active wish list on your phone at any given time for different games. Mm-hmm. What portion of your list would you say you were able to check off just by visiting Retro Game Con?
A small fraction.
Oh, okay. So it's a pretty large list.
I mean, okay, so I'm going to bring it up right now. for the various consoles. Each one I have between 4 and 10 or 12 games.
Okay.
So I don't know that I'll ever attain them all. It's just something I like to keep in mind. Really, my list for NES is getting pretty short. I just want to have like a good Mega Man game, Kirby, Contra, Ninja Gaiden. That's about it for the original Nintendo.
Right.
Super Nintendo, Predators vs. Aliens, Super Metroid, Kirby, Yoshi's Island, Mario Kart, Mega Man X, and some version of the Turtles beat-em-up game, because they did arcade ports of the original Turtles arcade beat-em-up for the NES, which I have. It's really good. Each system has a Turtles game. I'd like to get it for... They're both beat-em-ups, very similar to the arcade game. I'd like to get a copy of each one for their respective systems. For Genesis, I'd like to get a copy of Galaxy Force 2, RoboCop vs. Terminator, Strider. There's a game called Turrican. There's 2 different versions of it. There's Super Turrican for the Super Nintendo and Mega Turrican for the Genesis, because the overseas version of Genesis is the Mega Drive.
Naturally.
And I'd like to get some top-down shooter for Genesis, but that's the funny... I've talked about this before, too. Genesis generally is cheaper to buy games for, but there's this one category of game, the top-down space shooter, that for some reason with Sega Genesis are super expensive. Like we're talking hundreds of dollars for bare cartridges.
It's crazy.
So I don't know that I'll ever attain one of those unless I get really lucky. And then there's a list of games for PlayStation/PlayStation 2. So I don't keep active lists for the Game Boy or the Game Gear, because those I tend to just sort of like spot things for fun. Also, I bring that up, I forgot 2 things. I got 2 Game Gear games as well.
Right.
I got Mickey Mouse Castle of Illusion, and I got Taz in Escape from Mars, which I also sampled those. They both work great and look great.
Nice. And you're using an actual Game Gear to play those?
I do have an actual Game Gear, yes.
Nice.
I plug it in, AC adapter into the wall, because those things, they eat up batteries. They're sort of infamous for... They'll swallow up all the power in 3 AA batteries in like 2 hours. Because the color screen and the technology of a Game Gear was way ahead of its time for 1990-ish. But they didn't know how to like power a color screen without just like sucking all the life out of a battery like in no time. So that's why that system, as a matter of fact, that's probably one of the big reasons that system and the Atari Lynx both kind of failed as handheld competitors to the Game Boy, because you could put batteries in a Game Boy, and even though it wasn't as high powered, and even though it wasn't in color, you could play it. You could just play it for hours, turn it off, play it again the next day, turn it off, play it again the next day, turn it off, play it a week later. Like they just, they just wouldn't die. And that was the downfall of the Game Gear and the Lynx. But I still love it.
So, I guess I'm wondering if this event was so far the place where you've been able to get the biggest amount of games in one shot from your list. Overall.
Oh, if it was?
Yeah. Have you gotten more somewhere else?
Yes, at the used game stores. And I have walked out of those stores with a higher quantity of games in my hand. But that's because early on in the collecting, like I'm getting to the point now where I'm whittling down the things that I want, the things that I think I want.
Right.
So you're getting to the point where most of the games that I still want are slightly more expensive. So I don't walk out of the store with having 3 or 4 games at a time. I walk in, I buy the one thing for $20 or whatever it is.
You can't get as much for 10 anymore.
Right. Like early on, it was just like I was just trying to... I also had this sort of... Sometimes I would go into a store with the idea that I'm not going in here as a 30-something-year-old adult with a list of classic games that I want to get. I'm walking in here in the mindset of a kid who doesn't have anything to go on.
Right.
Just walk into the store and say, that game looks cool.
Yeah.
So, and you could do that on the cheaper racks and find some good hits for $2 or $3. And I found a lot of cool games like that for that kind of money, Right. Dino Wars and Magmax and some different kinds of shooters and Star Force and Phantom 2040 for the Super Nintendo. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff that I found for cheap. But now that I've kind of whittled off all the stuff that I can get for cheap, it's harder to walk out of a store having 3 or 4 or 5 games in my hand. But early on, I could go buy like almost like probably 6 or 7 games at a time and spend $20.
Well, I'm not sure. Again, I don't know that I really necessarily have such a specific wish list, just kind of a general one. But I don't know. I've never really been able to check a lot of it off. I guess my video game buying is similar to my kind of approach to comics in that it's usually kind of specific. It's usually, especially with video games, I kind of just focus on one thing at a time. At least with comics, I might focus on getting something by one artist at a time or whatever, but I can kind of look in the Superman bins, and if they don't have that, then I'll go over to the X-Men or whatever.
Right.
But with the video games, it's more like, for whatever reason in my brain, oh, they don't have this one that I want. Well, maybe I'll find something else next time. It's like, well,
Right.
I mean, you can look around a bit. I don't know why there's like a disconnect in my brain for that.
Yeah, I do probably follow the same path because the system I've talked about before, the system that's the hardest to buy for is the Super Nintendo because they have more expensive games for some reason.
Yeah, I noticed that actually even there.
Yeah, it's true. So I usually start there thinking I'll find something if I'm lucky. And if not, I can always go over to the Nintendo, which usually there's some cheap stuff along with the mediumly priced stuff.
Right.
And then Genesis, like I said, except for that one genre of like space shooters, I can usually always find something that's on the cheap side that looks interesting. So yeah, I do kind of the same thing. I start in one place and then I can whittle to the next one. And I have a sort of a process of elimination when I go out on a trip to come away with something. Because I'll stick to the list, but if I'm not finding what's on the list, I will still peruse.
Yeah.
To see if there's anything that looks interesting.
Yeah, it's probably a good strategy. I've actually been kind of on a personal quest, as it were, to find the best way to get a system or a console or a method, really, of playing as many of these classic games as possible with as little, hardware involved as possible, but also, ideally as little investment as possible.
Right.
So I go back and forth on how I want to achieve this. But one thing that doesn't necessarily involve minimal hardware or minimal price, but that did catch my eye that they had there, was this kind of, I don't want to say clone, but like kind of reproduction, independently made Nintendo 8-bit console called the AVS. Are you familiar with that at all?
It sounds vaguely familiar. I haven't read up on it or anything, though.
I guess it's kind of higher end. It's around, when it came out, it was around $200. It can kind of generally be had for around $185 online.
Right.
They had it for $150. And if I had the spare money, I probably would have gone the route of getting it there because that's kind of the best price. But it caught my eye because they were playing these, the competition you mentioned where the guys kind of created their own games for it, 8-bit Nintendo, and they were able to be played on this console as well as all the classic ones.
Right.
And this thing can also play the Japanese Famicom games all in one system.
That's pretty cool.
And it's also kind of considered, I think you can play it in high def, but it's also kind of a truer representation of the actual pixels on screen. There's not as much kind of distortion or whatever that even on the classic Nintendo system was.
Right.
So yeah, I'm really intrigued, but again, you can only kind of play 8-bit games, 8-bit Nintendo games.
Yeah. And there's a similar system that we've discussed before, the Analog NT,
Right.
which is another high-end sort of aftermarket console or post-market, I don't know, independently crafted, I guess, console for playing Super Nintendo games. I don't know if it plays Super Famicom, but
Yeah.
So it's a kind of similar thing where they're kind of high-end new systems. They don't emulate. A lot of these clone systems, it's hardware, but they basically rip the ROM and play it out of the memory. So it's still emulating. But I don't know, so I go back and forth because, yes, it's probably a more pure way to play the game. And the clone system that I have does emulate, even though it's hardware. And the clone system that I got failed.
Right.
But it also only cost me $40, and that's with both slots.
Yeah.
To just get an NES player from Retrobit or Hyperkin will cost me less than $30.
Yep.
So, yes, you're giving up the purity of the experience if you want to be snobby, but you're also paying a fraction of the price.
Yeah.
Those are the things. Those are the weights on the opposite sides of the scale that you have to balance and see what's more important.
Yeah, I think generally most people probably would pick the option that, pun intended, gets them in the game then necessarily gets them an experience that would kind of be considered, like an archival experience that preserves every possible nuance that you can get. I mean, it sounds funny. It sounds funny to say these things about, 8-bit or 16-bit games that are primitive by today's standards, but they're an important piece of not just gaming history, but the history of pop culture in general.
Pop culture. I mean, they're art as much as movies or music or TV shows or any other kind of.
For sure,
I believe.
Absolutely. I mean, this specifically was a video game based convention, but go to any other type of convention and look around, and you'll see a plethora of examples of all of these classic characters that started on the system, or even before. I mean, you'll see a billion Mario cosplays, you'll see a billion Link and Zelda, and the list goes on and on.
Absolutely.
I'm just thinking that it's actually I guess a company called Retro USB makes this AVS console, this high-end NES kind of reproduction console. And, between that and the Super Nintendo version that we mentioned earlier.
Analog NT.
There it is. And I'm sure there's stuff like that for probably virtually every type of system where it's kind of giving you the purest experience for a kind of premium price. Things like that. I was just thinking, I wish you could still kind of rent and just try these things out, and maybe you decide you don't want to go all in a commitment financially, but you at least have the experience of seeing like how good it really is.
Yeah, that kind of goes along with the downfall of the brick and mortar rental store as a trend, not really a trend, but as a reality. Because you used to be able to go to a video store and also rent video games, and at certain video stores, larger ones, you could also rent entire consoles.
Yeah, I used to do it a lot.
You could do that sort of thing.
Growing up poor.
And the downfall of that sort of market, I think those two things go hand in hand. There's no place for the AVS to get any. People can't get their hands on it unless they just buy it.
Yeah.
There's no place to sample that, which would probably be beneficial to the people who make it.
Yeah.
But I guess there's not enough there to be beneficial to the people who would own a store like that, because financially those stores failed.
Yeah, they don't exist for a reason. I mean, I think ultimately probably the place to try it out was the Retro Game Con. But I mean, that's just a quick little taste. I want to, be able to kind of put it through its paces for a week or so.
Right. Yeah.
Spend some time with it.
Yeah. But I agree. I mean, you'd still be faced with the ultimate choice of the experience versus the cost. So that's always going to be the thing. But I think, in terms of like the answer you're going to get from the most people about how to experience all of these things is going to be through emulation.
Right.
That's the thing you're going to hear over and over and over again. Raspberry Pi, emulators. And it's true. I mean, you can find the software, you can download the ROMs, they're all playable. But for me, maybe the more important part of the experience into actually playing the game is the act of sort of the physical nature of looking and finding and playing and holding and that sort of thing. I like that part.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Retro USB, any interest in sending us a review system? Huh?
Come on now. You want to.
And we could say things like, this episode brought to you by Retro USB. Have you tried the AVS?
Well, you should, damn it.
Yeah. Well,
maybe I'm
not sure yet, but soon I'll be able to tell you.
I think the actual promo probably should be slightly less wordy.
Probably.
I'll have to tighten that up a little bit.
It's good. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I had a great time. It was probably some of the comic convention stuff we went to this year kind of got me back into the comic book thing. But I think this one was sort of the most fulfilling experience, I think, both in terms of sort of being a part of this interest that I now have in this retro gaming thing that's come upon me in the last couple of years, but also the overall event was very professional and just seemed it was just put together really well. And so it was a really good experience.
Yeah, I thought so. I kind of felt like, and I think I mentioned this on the day, that it was, to me, kind of the ideal convention that I would like to attend. It was big enough to feel, very important and official, but small enough to not feel totally overwhelming.
Right. With a day, you could see everything in a day.
Could.
Without having to be rushing around and feeling hurried. So
right.
I definitely look forward to going next year and doing exactly that.
Yep. Same here. I guess that brings our recap of our experiences at Retro GameCon 6 to a close. I have been your friend Claude.
And I've been just Jamie.
And we will see you
later.
The N.E.R.D.Bomber podcast is a Ghost Factory internet production brought to you by the WAM Network.